Well, that was wonderful. And I hope you all are enjoying yourselves. We are now going to have a panel discussion and ask for your questions and kind of discuss the importance of preserving Black women's history. So I would like to introduce Ms. Adrena Ifill from Doubleback Global Productions, who will manage our Q&A. I'll invite our speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'd like to invite our speakers up to take the stage, and I invite you all. I know that you've probably been social media, but now's the time for us to actually ask those questions in person. And so there's going to be a microphone over here, and then there's a microphone in the back if need be. So get ready for that. I'm going to start off with a few questions, but then we definitely want to hear from you all. Do you want us to pick up the mic?
You know what? We could have everybody.
We're going this way? Okay, so we are moving on.
Yes, and please hold your mic.
Okay, yeah.
You don't want to. Okay, great. So everybody can hear us? Okay, wonderful. Well, this has been an incredible panel. I didn't realize we were going to church, but we did. And Easter week, we are resurrecting a lot of wonderful, wonderful stories that sadly were on the margins, but no longer, thanks to this esteemed panel here. So I have a few questions that I wanted to sort of kick off the discussion with, and then we're definitely going to hear from our also esteemed guests that have joined us. And I'm going to just start off with Dr. Phillips. I'm going to go to Dr. Foreman, each of you taking a turn as you see fit. How does collecting Black women's archives speak to our current cultural and political movements and activism? Just a small question.
Right, a small question. So, thank you. Easy, as the last panelist just said, nothing's been done before. And so one of the things that we say in terms of what we're collecting and how we're collecting and how it influences today's society, not just in our scholarship, but just in having our current activists understand what's been done already, what worked, what didn't work, how does it work, and being in conversation again with those activists in the past. Like, there's no reason to do something that failed 50 years ago, or there's no reason not to do something that was successful 50 years ago, simply because you're not sure that it happened. And what you see with a lot of the current activists is that they are paying attention, that they are looking at what has happened in the past. They are doing their research, they are having those conversations, and so the archives is a wonderful place for them as almost like a training ground for what they're going to encounter and what they're going to face in today's activism.
I would like to add that, again, having done undergraduate work, I was in a department with Merce Tate, Elsie Lewis, Letitia Woods Brown, Olive Taylor, and the chair was Lorraine Anderson Williams. These were 5 accomplished African American women historians and scholars. So frequently I had to remind myself that when they talk about coming from the margins, I didn't experience that. I experienced a department where it was understood that African American women had value, and probably, I think, the most influential historian that was from outside my department was Helen Edmonds from North Carolina Central, who we had a lecture by Dr. Franklin, John Hope Franklin, and he talked about Dr. Edmonds and her support when he had this idea called From Slavery to Freedom. So I think that there is a sense of how African American women's history is done in institutions where it is quote unquote new versus African American women's history where it is a part of the, I would say, the intellectual fabric, and it makes up the actual paradigm that you operate under. And I think it served me well as a student at Maryland, first woman, first African American in this department. And when I came in the first day, they said, the person said, "You can't come in there." Look, what are you coming? Turn around, third day, don't come in. I said, "Excuse me." So they've already gotten the trash. I had already been a professor for 4 years. Yes, the trash. And my suit, my briefcase, your African American face means you're here to collect trash. So that served me well in the sense of it prepares you for the realities you're going to face in these African American environments. Like it insulates you. And my response was, "I'm here for class," and I sat down. But you understand that where it is something quote unquote new, it resonates in a different way from me, for example, where it was understood that you were going to do history and you were going to include African American women. And so I just think that it, as you said, it's a part of this activism, but I would encourage, as people understand scholarship, that they look to many of those earlier scholars who were at institutions, who were doing it, who continue to do it, even if they were considered invisible. They were very active and very serious scholars. And I think that is an important part of what has to be understood when you talk about African American women's history and its legacy.
Thank you. So thank you for the question, and thank you again. Just want to say thank you one more time to Dr. Lopez-Matthews. And to Ms. Adrena Ifill. Just really incredible partners to work with. Thank you. And to my class too for making the trip. I appreciate that. So I think that I guess what I heard when you asked that question was Angela Davis, freedom is a constant struggle, right? And so thinking about, the archives are so important, but it's also the process of building and maintaining and passing on those archives that is so critical. Kimberly Crenshaw was just at Penn State a couple weeks ago, and she talked about the erasures, the erasures of Black women as a kind of intersectional violence, and thinking about the archives as one kind of response and antidote to that, and building on what has been done before. And I think, I wrote down when you were asking about women who have done the recovery work, and that work continues. It's just work that continues, and white supremacy as a structure is very nimble, right? And is constantly changing. So the responses that people had in the 19th century and the 18th century, those responses maintain. They shift and they change to meet new circumstances, but like Cooper said, we learn wisdom from looking at these strategies that people have developed to address these challenges. And I'll stop there. I might say more in a little bit, but I'll stop there.
I think what is most powerful about the way that activists today are encountering the new landscapes of conducting their work is the quickness and almost the viral nature of everything that they do, right? They are so much like their cultural ancestors in their commitment to preserving and to refusing to be erased from the media and from the public view, right? Our violence will not be behind closed doors. We will not be silent about it. Ooh, a little closer, perfect. But I wonder what activists would think about if their frame of reference changed a little, if the ancestors that people who were protesting Stephonzo Clark's murder in Oakland, shutting down the convention center where the basketball game was, if instead they were not linking themselves to Mabel, not Mabel, I'm blanking.
Throws the hand, throw the whole
Jet
group in.
magazine cover.
Oh, Mamie Till.
Mamie
Yep.
Till, and her effort to prevent the erasure of her son's disfigurement and violence, but instead going even further back to the color convention minutes, thinking about all of the detailed stories about lynchings that were created there in this document to do the same work. If they think about, instead of how difficult it was to organize throughout the South during the Freedom Riders movement, what about what it took when it was the 19th century and people were still in horses and buggies and carriages and moving by train, and there was no planes. What do we do with that, right? What do we do differently when we think about the true legacy of our work and how we might center our self-care throughout this process? We have been doing this for generations, and we accumulate that, not just that struggle, but that pain and that suffering. And I think that we could also look to our ancestors not just for a larger understanding of the legacy of the work, but also the survival, right? They survived that. Some of them survived till they were 100 years old, still fighting. So, you know, how do we consider our self-care as a reflection of their work, and how do we continue to honor that and to honor ourselves when every day we have to stand up for this fight? So that's what I would say. Yeah.
If white supremacy is nimble, patriarchy is also so very nimble. And it's amazing to me, as someone who loves men and loves anybody with male-identified folks who are not patriarchal, to think about how we still have to deal with the erasure of black women in so many realms. And to go back to Angela Davis, right, who talks all the time about how black women are the fastest growing prison population, but we always talk about men who are imprisoned. I mean, we know that there are more black men in prison and parole than there are in colleges, right, et cetera. Where do black women fall in that? So the question, it seems to me, that motivates this work in so many ways for activists today is that they're still struggling with what we've always had to struggle with, right? Which is the erasure of black women. Say her name says that somebody ain't saying it, right? And it remains up to our community to think about centering black women in activism as well, and for our community, not just the women in our community, but for our larger community, to take folks to task when they do things like this amazing article that just came out about black male wealth not being passed on, black family wealth not being passed on to black men, right? And not leaving it to black women to have to articulate why we are important and we need to be centered and acknowledged. And when we do that work, not to think of that as some kind of betrayal of black men, when black women have been about supporting black men and male-identified folks for a long time. So it just seems to me that we need to do this work together as a collective, to make sure that our whole community, our cousins and our brothers and our sisters, right, and our siblings and our uncles and our aunts, right, are taken care of, and not to continue to ask black women to have to do the labor to protect ourselves and to protect our community members, right, our sons and our nephews at the same time. So I ask for that help in this community and in all communities, right? That we shoulder this burden together, and that activists don't have to do it all, both at once all the time.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask one more question because I definitely want to get to you all without running out of time. So go ahead and you can get up and go to the microphones if you choose to. I have one question because I have to remind myself you guys aren't in my living room, because I have a lot more questions. But I'm gonna switch a little gears, and whoever wants to jump in and answer, feel free. We talked one of the impetuses for us being here is the digital humanities. And so that's a personal favorite of mine. And as you were talking, Dr. Foreman, I was thinking about the possibilities. And I was also thinking in all the conversations about the mythologies that are out there, the incorrect facts, or inconsistencies and errors that have been passed on to believe certain things. So if you were, each of you, or whoever wants to stretch, what would you imagine that digitization can do to expand this conversation? What, in your wildest imaginations, in this 21st century where we have all these tools that we can really reach back as far as we can possibly reach back into people's drawers for the material culture, into the archives that we sit in these books, what's hidden in there on the written page, what's underneath in terms of the scrapbook example, and what's actually going to fall out of a dust jacket that maybe have been put there on purpose but not part of a bound collection. What would you want to see? What would you want to have illuminate for the next generation?
Okay. She said anybody jump in, but okay.
That meant you.
I guess as a curator for the Arthur and Elizabeth Schlesinger Archives on the History of Women in America, got it. One of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. All of that. One of the things we have to think about, and I like that you said at the end to talk about how do we think about for what's in the future, to reach back. But one of the really interesting things we have to do as curators, as preservationists, as people who are keeping the record is to not only reach back, but also to look forward. So when you think in terms of not just what was important, what did we think was important, what actually did we actually keep, but where are the things that are missing and how do we fill in those gaps for the future? So when we think in terms of thinking over time, and so in the digital humanities, I think it's a really, really wonderful way of reaching not just through time, but also through space. As we've already said a few times, there's people who are doing research right here at Moorland, but they're not here at Moorland. They're looking at the Anna Julia Cooper papers, and they're in France, and they're comparing, and they're looking at her life there, and they're looking at how she affected women there, not just women, but society there, and how she also affected society here. And so we're thinking over time and space, and we're moving in ways and in directions that is something that I don't know that they could have imagined in Anna Julia Cooper's day. I remember having a conversation with Paul Coates, and I asked him from Black Classic Press, and I was asking him about science fiction and what was happening. He was like, Kimby, we're living in science fiction right now. The things that we're able to do with the digital humanities and how we're able to produce books and publish work with very few people and limited space and limited time and also limited funds was something you couldn't have imagined 30 years ago. And so you think in terms of moving through time and space in ways and in routes that are not linear, that are not narrow, that are wide, and that can go in ways that we can't think. So my thoughts are to say, what I can imagine, I'm just looking forward to the next generation being able to do things that I can't even think of. And I want to be able to do the work to make sure that they can do the things that we can't even think of. And I think that there's one group of people that haven't really been mentioned that we should mention, particularly when it comes to digital humanities, are the people who are processing, the archivists who are doing the describing, both in the physical descriptions and also the metadata that are doing the descriptions, so that when you go to look and you say, well, are we doing Black women? Well, how are we describing Black women? Are they colored women? Are they Negro? Are they club women? Those things are very important. So we talk about how we have this understanding of who these women are and who's saying it and who's not saying it. Definitely want to give that shout out to those folks who are doing that work, particularly in the digital humanities.
I think that when you talk about engendering history and framing new paradigms in history, that again, as an oral historian, I just think that there are ways that these oral histories and their preservation, these issues are so important. I'm thinking of the people who worked, and they're still alive, with Rosa Parks. People think of her always with the start of the bus boycott, but for a decade before that, she was doing extensive research on African American women and violence in the different areas of the rural South. And understanding how those voices have to be captured. They're not going to sit down and write books. They don't have the time, the expertise, whatever. But there are those people who worked with major persons in history, and it's just not being captured. And I just think that it is incumbent upon us when we have these opportunities. I'm looking at a student who is doing legacy institutions. These institutions, Ms. Edwards, they no longer exist. But they were very important to the African American community as trade schools, training schools, etc. And she has made it her business to look at these schools and look at the important impact they had on the African American community. These histories are there, they're yearbooks, it's there. How do we begin to reach out and understand new ways of approaching history? And just before I hand the mic over, I'd like to also recognize Dr. Dana Williams, who's chair of the Department of English here, who her students have done phenomenal works in new ways of engaging history and then writing about the impact of violence and women and these institutions. So I do think that it's important to understand these issues, as you said, how they evolve, and these digital issues, but very importantly, in our outreach, we have to reach beyond traditional walls and understand the importance of people who are engaging history on the most basic community level, and the significance of their voices and the retention of those stories and voices.
So I would add to that and echo that, and I guess in my wildest dreams, I mean, if we're going to go there, I think exactly what you were saying, thinking about how could we use digital humanities to capture and make accessible everyday experiences, like just such a broad range beyond, even what is been maintained or recovered in different institutional structures. And then if I'm going to keep going, I would love to see new ideas about knowledge production emerge from our rethinking of the digital humanities. And I would like to see Black women's work and writing drive the structures of what DH does, as opposed to the other way around, right? And trying to continue to think about how can we use the existing structures to fit Black women's work into those structures, and see that kind of flipped on its head, and think about what do we need to capture these stories? What do we need to capture the range and mode of expression and communication that just doesn't get captured in some of these more traditional formats? And I think that what Professor Foreman was speaking about in terms of seeing that dynamic relationship between what is happening in the digital humanities and what is happening in community and institutional spaces, and seeing that kind of organizing be the kind of heartbeat for the work that we do going forward, and knowing that there's a reciprocal relationship between DH projects and organizing on the ground and collaborative work. I'm really seeing collaborative work kind of drive what happens in this next iteration.
I think actually in my wildest dreams, I have two specific notions that come out of what you've just said. The first, in my wildest dreams, I imagine a community, a large and growing community of young Black women who get to be digital nerds, unapologetically, paid equally, celebrated equally, and no one is staring at them as the unicorn in the room, like, what are you doing here? Oh my God, it's either amazing or it's quite possibly our downfall, right? I would be, right? It would be one of those beautiful moments. And I didn't realize I wanted that until I joined the sort of digital team, our studio lab right now. It's in CCP that's working on our website. And we have a very diverse room, but I'm fairly new to some of the elements of this work. And I'm sitting there as a Black woman in this room, learning how to deal with coding and with transferring data and thinking about how this should be user-friendly and ADA-friendly or compliant. And I nerded out completely. And I've never done that before around DH. And I said, wow, is this what young Black women should be feeling when they go to coding classes for the first time because they now have a grant, right, that they never had before, right? Why aren't we funneling young women into these spaces? Why aren't we encouraging Black women scholars to explore in this realm? And if they can feel that joy too, right, that's in my wildest dreams. And the other part is that part of why I love the archive and why I think making it accessible through digital platforms is that the archive will demonstrate pleasure and just internal, like, self-value in surprising places that people need to read and see for themselves. You really need to have that moment. So I was in a class recently with Professor Laura Helton at the University of Delaware, and she brought for us photocopies from an archive of oral histories that were taken by sociologists at an HBCU. And she said very few people ever look at this because it's uncatalogued, not digital. Basically, you have to go to that box and happen to stumble upon it to see it. And in it, there are these beautiful stories that these sociologists recorded of people telling their experiences in slavery, being the last generation, and also conveying it in that space to their grandchildren and their children. And they are so honest about the ways they resisted, the ways that they sassed, the way that they, threw shade on everything, but also centered their survival. And I rarely get an opportunity to see that in scholarly settings. I have to go looking through archives. I have to go over and over and over again through Harriet Jacobs' book in order to revive that feeling and to say, wow, we had this. We had our moments of pleasure and just sass and wonderfulness. And I think we need that to be in more spaces for more people to access. So that we're not the angry Black woman in contemporary society. We come from a long heritage of shade and wonderfulness in embracing our pleasure and putting that above other constraints and oppression. So yeah.
I think I'm really boring when I come to dreaming, right? And so I would want to dream not only with my sister historians and archivists and literary historians and oral historians, but also with the technologists in the room. I need them to throw some color in my dreams, and so I would want to dream with them. But when I'm dreaming by myself, I think the dream you articulated so clearly, which is that we recognize that communities know their own histories, and that communities are the unlockers of those histories. We need to listen to them. So I would affirm that CCP has been running workshops recently that one, you need to have those communities in the room, right, before we can have that kind of community knowledge and respect for that community knowledge there. And so we've created protocols when we are asked to speak. So we don't speak alone anymore. That's why Brandy is here, and we just don't do that, right? So, and we also don't go to speak without sending them a sheet of everybody they need to invite, right? So the HBCU near there, you better, all of them, okay, the English professor, the head of public history. I'm not trying to go to, a Tulane and not have an Xavier there, right? So So we have a protocol. Black bookstores, we want those people there. We want a flyer there, right? So we have a whole list of people who we want to be in the room with because that's our community. And because it's easy to forget that if you're at a PWI being funded by PWIs, being invited by PWIs, and you have to remind them, right, that to get a room that looks like this, you actually have to work. You have to do some work. And then people come, and then they're all surprised, right? So, you invited, they will come, right? So then we get in rooms with workshops, and the ways in which DH can connect the local to the global is just so exciting to me. And so we have them, we invite people to read convention minutes from their own states, from their own cities. And they know stuff we don't know. They know stuff that Philip Foner didn't know when he was annotating, right? Like they know, right? So they know who all the families are, right? Denise was there at this workshop we just did at Tulane, right? And it was the folks from Dillard and at Xavier and the community, right, who knew who these folks were. So Dillard, man, I'm in the wrong place. No, I'm in the right place. So all of a sudden, all this knowledge comes together. So we're thinking about holding annotate-a-thons and involving communities like the church you're working with to go back to their documents, to figure out what technology we need in the room, right, in order to capture that knowledge. And then how do we create a curriculum that allows people who are teaching classes, right, Ben and the chair of English and the chair of public history, to then go think about where the secondary resources can affirm or not confirm, right, so that we have like several eyes on the material that is coming through the annotate-a-thons, right? So we're dreaming about the ways in which the local and the community voices who know their own history way better than we do, right, can bring that into a format that is mediated through digital technologies and that are brought then out to other communities in scholarly arenas to affirm and integrate that into a line of sort of knowledge production so that we can capture that oral history in collective and local ways.
Can I have another drink?
Yes.
Did you say, can I have another drink? Did you say another drink? Did you say like, oh, I'm sorry. We're in her living room, so I thought we might be,
We're in her living room, so I want to have this one drink real quick. I always think when I talk to potential donors and researchers and scholars, and I think in terms of the kind of domino effect of how scholarship affects our society and our life. And it's nice to have the conversation about how digital humanities will affect scholarship, but I always think to say, oh, well, I want to, in my wildest dream, this digital humanities project will change our water cooler conversations. It will change our societal conversations. It will change when you asked about those myths, when you have those things that we take for granted that are wrong, but we take it for granted anyway. With this easily accessible material will change those narratives and change those conversations. So the scholars, we're collecting these materials and then we're digitizing materials, and then the scholars will access these materials, they'll write the books, and then the movies will be made, the television shows will be made, and then the wider populace will have a new understanding of what has happened. So you think about Hidden Figures, you think about, that's the only one I got right now. Think about Hidden Figures, you think about Wakanda, what's the name of the movie? Black Panther, that's the name of the movie. You think about all of these kind of transformative, you think about Marshall, the movie that just came out, these kind of figures where we think about, oh, we know who he is or we know who she is, but we don't really know. So now we're complicating the conversation, so it's beyond, what we're thinking and, nerding out. Yeah, we want to nerd out, we want to be able to nerd out, and also our neighbor who's not going to nerd out can also get excited about what we're excited about. And so that also makes that anomaly like, oh, I'm not the only one, there's somebody else. And so for my wildest dream, that would be probably it as well.
So questions from the audience. We have about 5 more minutes. So anybody wants to nerd out on the microphone, feel free.
Just first a quick comment and then a question. Kenva, you mentioned Flemmy Kittrell as a prominent nutritionist, but I want everybody to know she was a head of the home economics department that was right across the way for many years. But my other question is, and I'm going to use another term I just heard, knowledge production. Some of the contemporary people think we're just discovering these long-time stories. And just to give you an example, I have a photograph that was taken in 1908 that includes a picture of a float that alludes to Susie Taylor, who was a nurse during the Civil War. And one of my educated friends said they knew about that. So in other words, in 1908, how did they know about Susie Taylor? As if we just discovered this stuff in 1960, for instance, or today. So many people now are uncovering diaries, letters, and so on. My question is, and I heard you say somebody's researching scrapbooks, okay. What is the precedent here? In other words, why did our forebears write diaries? Why did Anna J. Cooper have the audacity to create a scrapbook? You know, I had a conversation one day with Judy Moore-Latter, who teaches communications here, and she had found some letters, love letters that were exchanged between her parents, I guess World War II or so. And she said there was a note in the drawer. She discovered it after her mother died. There was a note in the drawer that said, "Don't throw these letters away." So Judy and I said, or Judy said, they knew that we would want to document their stories one day. So the question is, are we looking at why they wrote, even Harry Jacobs and so many other people that we don't know about right now? Why did they write, and why did they know that their stories would be important one day?
And please tell us your name.
I'm Linda Critchlow White.
Anybody want to take that?
I think that Ms. Critchlow White, who is very well known for documenting data, hit it on the head, that they knew that these are important stories, and it's our obligation to bring them to the fore. But I also think that there is a nagging feeling I have is that I did a film called Freedom Bags with Stanley Nelson that looked at women and work, particularly household workers, in 1990. And at the end, the issue of a dream, and the woman ends the film by saying, "I wouldn't have no dream, mister. I was too busy working." And then she talks about her life and this work that she did. So dreaming can be important, but you have to put it within the context of people's realities. And so I think that that's the key, understanding their realities, and I also think respecting. It just becomes so important, as you said, to understand what are the institutions contiguous to these major institutions that may have existed long before them. When you remember that, other than the University of District of Columbia, Howard's older than Catholic, Georgetown, American, George Washington, but it's in the sense that how do we sort of figure out how to fit Howard in when it probably should be the other way around? And I'm only using that in the sense of Xavier, but also these legacy institutions that Ms. Edwards is looking at. Many of them evolved right on the cusp of the Civil War, and they have hundreds and hundreds of records. Where are they? In people's homes. Who's looking at them? And more importantly, who's understanding this rich legacy that they've been able to weave into the social fabric of the community where they exist?
Your question?
First of all, I'd like to thank each of you for your presentations. This has just been a truly moving program. Dr. Clark Lewis, I think you probably don't remember, but I heard you speak at the University of Delaware many, many years ago, and I still recall how you gave me a new perspective on the shopping bags that the domestics carried home, and how they were a source of pride because it meant that they could come home at the end of the day and they didn't have to be live-ins. But I have a couple of technical questions for Dr. Phillips and for Dr. Moody Turner, and then one for everyone. For Dr. Phillips, can you talk a little bit about the percentage of materials that have been digitized, Black women's materials at Schlesinger that have been digitized, and how you go about prioritizing those collections that do get selected for digitization? And for Dr. Moody Turner, I'm curious to know, as you were working with the Anna Julia Cooper papers, did you get a sense of the extent of the body of her work that might reside outside of her papers, and is there any prospect for digitizing those materials? And then for everyone on the panel, as we are creating digital materials, so is everyone else, and Google in particular is moving things along at a great pace. How do we keep now from having such volume of digital materials that our materials aren't again hidden? And I guess expanding from that, is there any thought on the utility of portals or some other way of highlighting all of the materials that we are digitizing?
Okay, that was an oral, that's going to be an oral dissertation. So I would say, I just want to invite everyone. What we're going to do is we're going to have a reception afterwards, so we want to invite everyone, and you'll be able to ask our panelists individual questions. And let me take yours. Hopefully it's short.
It is.
Okay.
Ana Araújo,
And
Department
then
of History.
once you ask your question, we'll have the responses, and then we'll close out.
Okay. Just to conclude, because thank you so much, Dr. Matthews, for this event, and I'm glad to see an all-women panel. At least here it happens. My question is, from here, where do we go now? Because the issue of digital history, and I know that all of you are doing work with preservation in different ways, but from the very short experience that I have seen in conferences, people who are doing digital history in terms of digitizing documents, I see very few Black academics involved in that. And this is very problematic because I see, for example, one example of that is that program by the British Library, the Endangered Archives, and I see academics, and there are a handful of them, who are coordinating these projects and going indeed even to other countries to do this kind of work and collect Black archives. And after, at the end of the day, they own the archives. They control the archives. They come to the conferences and they display how many projects they are involved and showing that they control these projects. My question is whether or not there is anything being done because you are doing these individual initiatives, but I ask myself in terms of a group. I had a question the other day, like, oh, these archives at Moorland, that may be something to be done there to digitize that. I said, it's being done. You don't need to go there to digitize that for us. But it's very uncomfortable because in this space here, I would say that is pretty much a comfortable space because we are not being questioned about that. But most part of the time, when you go to these conferences on databases, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, I would say that is one of the biggest examples, is male-dominated and are white men who are doing that. And I think that we should be paying attention to these things because in the real world, this is what is happening, and I am really glad to see more and more projects of digital history, and urge you to continue doing that, and especially to establish these networks, because this is very important.
And tell us your name.
My name is Ana Araújo, Department of History.
Okay, I have closing statements, probably good that I'm at the end. I'm a member of the group called FREED. I think Dr. Clark mentioned it. Female Reenactors of Distinction. We're a sister group to the Civil War, African American Civil War Museum. And so we have taken it as our mission to resurrect and keep alive the stories of freed women during the Civil War period. And so know that there are people out there working on the behalf of Black women's stories. In the absence of actual diaries, we find as much information as we can through research and give them a voice so that they are not lost in history and their accomplishments are made known. And so keep an eye out on what we're doing, and we invite your support, and also encourage you to come see the museum so that we can keep these stories alive. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So much.
Oh, wow. Let's go back. I'm going to answer as briefly as I can, which...
Thank you.
which is not very brief. We'll go back to one of the original questions, which was about digitization at the Schlesinger and how much is digitized on Black women at the Schlesinger. And first, I have to say that we have a large collection, and in total, we have a small percentage of our collection is being digitized regardless of race or ethnicity, and it's less than 5% because there's so much material. It's a lot of material. We have over 3,500 manuscript collections and hundreds of thousands of published volumes, and so we don't have the capacity as of yet to digitize everything, and I don't know if anybody does, right? This is not, you know, but we do have quite a few collections that are digitized. Dorothy West's collection is digitized in its entirety and is available online. Our Oral History Project, Black Women's Oral History Project, is digitized and is available online, and we have portions of other Black women's collections like Polly Murray and Florence Kennedy are digitized and they're available online, and that is one thing that we are doing is as we digitize things, we try to make them available online immediately, and the process of trying to decide what we digitize and what order we put it in. There is a committee. We look at the condition of the material, we look at use of the material, we look at trends in scholarship, we look at weighing a lot of different things, and then try to, at that point, make a priority list for this quarter, and then we'll have another priority list for the next quarter, and so forth and so on like that until we can do as much as we can. But again, we have a lot of material, and we're constantly trying to get more material, both paper and born digital, and so all of that, you know, that's the best answer I can give for that. We do have quite a few collaborative efforts that we've made, including a digital portal for our Judy Chicago collection, where we're working with Penn State. We're looking at us and then another repository. So portals are very important for heightened awareness and accessibility for collections, regardless of race or ethnicity. And where do we go from here? In about 2 weeks, the Radcliffe Institute is actually going to host a workshop where we've invited some 50 institutions, HBCUs, predominantly white institutions, Ivy League institutions, so the Big Ten, the Sisters, state schools. We've invited the federal government, and we've, from National Archives as well as the National Park Service, to have a conversation about how we can work together and how we can work together as a collective and move our discipline forward in as far as digital humanities and creating collaborative projects. And also we're trying to get people in the room so that they can have more projects like what Penn State did with Moorland, and what we've actually done a project with Spelman College, so to digitize some of the materials there. So we're trying to move the conversation forward. So in 2 weeks, and it will be recorded, and I will see if I can send links out to individuals so that you can have that information. So we're trying to help to foster an environment so we can have relationships, so that folks can have those partnerships, and then if we can have a large collective, that will be something that will be there. Athena Jackson is actually one of our advisory committee members to help put that event on. So we are working, we're trying to move things forward. It's a short way I can go.
I'll make mine very quick. I do hope that, again, picking up on your dream issue, that people understand the importance of community-based resources and respecting the resources and the work that has been done. I'm drawing a blank and I apologize. The late archivist Davis from DC, Clarence Davis, and
Bill Branch.
Bill Branch. I apologize. Archivist Branch. Blame it on my head, not my heart. But they have done an incredible oral history collection of community-based data. And that is the kind of material I'd like to see us, because it's done, it has been done. It relates directly to the, I would say, the regional history, but they focus so much on the words, the actions, the lives, employment realities of everyday people. And it's just a huge, and there are many of those collections that are out there. And I would like to see a focus on not simply what can we do, but understanding and respecting what has been done, and how do we then incorporate that. As I said, even down to creed, which is working with material culture. Literally, every stitch follows of the outfits they wear are historically, they follow history. So they're all sorts of different and innovative ways of understanding and approaching and acquiring, and most importantly, respecting history, women's history in particular. Thank you.
I will be brief as well. So just to get back to your question, Carol, Howard, the Moorland-Spingarn holds the majority of the Cooper papers that are that we know about that are kind of extant. Oberlin has a couple folders of Cooper's papers as well. And then there are traces of Cooper's work kind of throughout. There's some in the Du Bois archives. There's some in the Chestnut. Chestnut's got a picture of Cooper. I'm not sure what that's about in his papers. But there's traces of Cooper kind of throughout. And that was one of the things that also kind of motivated this project, was the idea of having to look for traces of Cooper, you know, in the archives of others, usually men, right? And the other thing too that motivated it was looking for places where she should have been, you know, and it's been hard, you know, but when she was working with her dissertation advisors in Paris, they had to communicate, right? So going to Paris and looking in those archives for communications that should be there. And so that's been part of this project, is looking, you know, not knowing if they're there. You know, usually when you get money, they want to know that you're going to look at something, not going to look at something that may or may not exist. But that's been a lot of this work, has been trying to find places where there are traces of her and where she should be. So there's a lot more work to be done. And just to mention, to go back on the scrapbook piece, and why people create, and looking at just a broader range of modes of expression and communication and community-based work, I think about, too, expanding beyond just scrapbooks, you know, and scrapbooks, you know, can be one artifact and one record of what people felt or thought was important, or how they chose to document their lives or the lives of their communities. But there are recipe books. There are, you know, different forms of material culture. There's dress. There's so many different modes through which, you know, Black women expressed and communicated their daily, you know, everyday lives and experiences. And I think it's really up to us to broaden what we think about, if we really want to be able to, you know, capture or, you know, incorporate the range of voices.
I wanted to thank the sister from the Civil War Museum. Yeah. And I believe the director now is African American woman too. Am I right? No, that's a different museum. Thank you for centering our experiences in a place where they're so often erased, but also erased with a kind of force, right, of memory. You're doing frontline work, obviously, you know, and I just wanted to thank you for announcing that to the group. And then I really want to thank you for your comments about the fact that we are rediscovering that which has already been caretaken, right? That has already been part of a history of cultural knowledge and affirmation in our own communities through oral histories and through preservation methods, and that if we don't acknowledge that, then we come with a colonizationist mindset that also can be fairly individualistic, right? And so I think I just want to thank you for bringing that back to our attention over and again. And then I want to thank you for your question about, I'm going to reinterpret it, what makes a Black project Black, right? Which is the question I heard you say. And how we can use a protocol of accountability, right? Friendly if it can be friendly, not so friendly if it doesn't need to be friendly, so that we can complicate the ontological questions and the colonizationist questions about academic gentrification, right? So, and it just seems to me important for us to think about the fact that subject isn't the only thing that makes something Black. How many graduate students, right, are involved? One of the things that is beautiful to me about DH is that it calls for a collectivity, right? It calls for a group of people to function together. And that's why we call everybody's name, right, when we're talking, because we need to model that as a methodology, right? And by going back to one person, the head, right, and knowing the head and talking about how the head person of a digital project, right, is doing amazing work, we're erasing the collectivity and the politics of that collectivity, right? Who's getting trained? Who's getting opportunities, right? How many graduate students are involved? How many IT, what are the empowerment politics, right, of the ways in which we think about the collectives that are working together to produce this kind of history, and then how do we make that public, right? If this is public, if these are public projects, why is it only the end that gets public, the public-facing part that gets public? We need to make the processes public, and then we can talk about the politics of accountability, right, around that very, right, politics. So we want to know, does your team have graduate students on it? Does your team have undergraduate students on it? Are they getting paid? Right? Like, who are they? I am not scared of a box on a spreadsheet that says black, right? That says people of color, right? I want to know and if this is a queer project, we should know who's queer, right? You know? And not to out anybody, but to make sure that people are involved in their own history, right? You know? I mean, I know this, and I am black and Jewish, let me just say it here, that if Jews had a group of folks who were producing their history and they weren't Jewish, can I get an amen? This would not go down, all right? It would not go down, all right? And I will use that example over and over again because it is one that resonates with white folks as viable, as acceptable, right? And so it should be acceptable to us to say that it is not okay to produce history that is a gentrified history, right? You cannot move into our neighborhoods, right, and not include us. We need some community-based agreements, right? Some CBAs in our own academic work. It's not just inclusion riders, right, which goes to a very different model. It is about community-based agreements, right, that protects the academic and intellectual and scholarly community that has been doing this work for decades, right, that cannot be moved out of the way at this moment, right, that was preserved for decades through people's labor that cannot be moved away at this moment. So we're producing spreadsheets at this point. We're in the moment of trying to do that says, right, how many people are involved, who's at the head, is it the subject that is black, is it the leadership, right? And this is not about a kind of quantifiable purity. It's about producing ethical production of distributed labor that is about training up a next generation that does not produce the photograph that you put online that went viral of 30 white men saying they're doing public history and applied history, right? There is a process to avoiding that production, right? And that process includes saying our names, right? And that has to be done. And we need to not be fearful of it, because there is always a place for scholars who are about the work, no matter their race, no matter their gender, no matter their sexuality. You about the work, right? You are welcome. Black folks have been real good at that. All right?
I just want to add at the end, though, when we think of archives and material, et cetera, the one reality everybody's tipping around is deaccessioning. Yeah. That you have archives that had lots of material, and you have archivists that decide what's important and what's not. So when you say you're going to Paris to look, you have to understand there could have been or not been the sensitivity that these were letters from this African American woman, not important pile, as opposed to the important pile. So I think that when you go to an archive looking, you have to be aware of the politics and the procedures for deciding what will remain and what can go away. It can be deaccessioned. It's not important. And so I think that that is a part of when you're saying when you go looking, if you're looking in institutions, you have to understand the institutional realities as opposed to many, many community-based institutions that don't have the same, they have different kinds of issues. But I would like to at least add that when you say go looking, you should be aware that when you're looking, you are dependent on the archivist's decision about what will be deaccessioned, and that's a reality.
And this is why it is so important that scholars don't just think about becoming academics, right? That we also talk about becoming archivists, right? And people who make decisions in cultural institutions, because without that kind of, right, so ways in which we can preserve our own history, it just won't happen.
So with that, I think we're going to conclude. I want to thank everyone. I want to take a moment. We have to do, I want to just do a brief close, and then Dr. Matthews has something to say. And as I said, we want to invite you all to join us for a reception across the hallway at the museum. But I definitely want to do a special thanks to Penn State University, the Eberly Family Special Collections Library at Penn State, Howard University Libraries, the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center, and a particular shout out to Miss Joellen El-Bashir, who was not here but always holding down the fort for us. Our panelists, also Mr. Errol Watkins in the back for making this all physically possible, and all the staff, interns, and faculty who contributed to the project as a whole and to the event. Thank you so much. My name is Adrena Ifill, and I have spent the last 15 years working in cultural projects. I consider archivists, librarians, historians, and academics some of my closest and dearest friends. And I really enjoy working then, and I really thank you all for being in my living room, because this is part of my dream, to have these conversations every week. And with that, I will give it over to another friend, colleague, Dr. Matthews.
So I just wanted to share with you all, I have the access to the data as we talk about the data. And one of the great things about this project is being able to share this history with people around the world. And I just wanted to share with you the top 10 countries that are looking at the Anna Julia Cooper collection. And so, of course, the United States is number one. The second is France, Brazil, the United Kingdom, Slovakia, Canada, India, Haiti, Indonesia, and Australia. So those are the top 10 places interested in the history of Anna Julia Cooper. And I thought Slovakia was most interesting because I'm like, and the top institution is the University of Edinburgh in the United Kingdom. So I wonder what they're looking at and what they're up to. So it's just one of the most exciting things to be able to digitize these collections and share them with the world, and have people from everywhere being able to have access to them, because that's what it's all about, providing access. So thank you all for coming. Enjoy the reception.
So there are parts of it that are